Picture this: a moonless night at sea, waves whispering against the hull of a medieval ship as seasoned sailors gaze upward, their faces bathed in an eerie, shifting glow. Without warning, the familiar silver disk of the moon begins to vanish, swallowed by an encroaching shadow. Panic ripples through the crew as the sky itself seems to unravel. To them, this isn't just an eclipse, it's an omen, a message from the heavens, perhaps even a portent of divine wrath. In an age where the stars were both compass and clock, a lunar eclipse could unravel the fragile confidence of empires, redirect the course of exploration, and rewrite the fate of kingdoms. This is the untold story of how celestial wonders didn't just inspire awe, they wielded real power over the rise and fall of maritime empires, shaping history in ways we've only begun to understand. Imagine the sheer terror of a fleet's navigators watching their guiding light, the moon, flicker and fade mid-journey. For medieval sailors who relied on the heavens to chart their paths across uncharted waters, an eclipse wasn't just a spectacle, it was a crisis. Trade routes hung in the balance. Battles were won or lost based on the superstitions these events ignited. A single eclipse could delay an armada, embolden an enemy, or convince a king to abandon a campaign altogether. The oceans were already a realm of danger and uncertainty, but when the skies themselves seemed to turn against humanity, even the most powerful empires found themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. But here's the twist: these moments of chaos also became opportunities. Some commanders saw eclipses not as curses, but as strategic tools. A clever admiral might exploit the fear of an eclipse to scatter an enemy fleet or rally his own men under the banner of divine favor. Scholars scrambled to decode the patterns of the heavens, turning superstition into science and giving birth to new methods of navigation that would eventually conquer the seas. Today, we'll trace how these celestial events didn't just disrupt history, they propelled it forward, forging empires and toppling dynasties in their shadow. From the whispered fears of sailors to the war rooms of kings, this is a tale of ambition, ingenuity, and the unpredictable dance between humanity and the cosmos. Strap in, we're about to uncover how the moon's fleeting darkness changed the world. To medieval eyes, a lunar eclipse was magic made real, a celestial drama where the moon was stolen by dragons, devoured by gods, or stained with the blood of battles fought beyond the clouds. But peel back the superstition, and you'll find a breathtaking cosmic dance centuries ahead of its time. Here's how it actually worked. When Earth slid precisely between the sun and the moon, our planet's shadow crept across the lunar surface, turning it copper red or swallowing it whole. Unlike solar eclipses, which vanish in minutes, lunar eclipses could last for hours, visible to everyone on the night side of the world. That slowness made them impossible to ignore and terrifyingly unpredictable to societies still mapping the heavens. Yet even in the Middle Ages, sharp minds were piecing together the truth. Take Al-Batani, the 9th century astronomer whose meticulous records proved eclipses weren't random acts of wrath but recurring events tied to the moon's orbit. He wasn't alone. From Baghdad to Byzantium, scholars scribbled notes about the shadow hour, calculating when the moon would next darken. Ship captains carried these predictions like treasure, scribbling eclipse dates in their logs alongside wind patterns and tide charts. For them, an eclipse wasn't just an omen, it was a celestial clock. Miss its timing, and you might lose weeks waiting for the next navigational checkpoint. But old fears die hard. Sailors whispered that a blood moon eclipse meant Poseidon was hungry, demanding sacrifices tossed overboard. Viking crews saw it as Odin's warning, turning their ships toward shore. Even as science gained ground, eclipses remained entangled with power. A clever ruler might claim the heavens endorsed his reign, like the Byzantine emperor who staged his coronation to coincide with an eclipse, framing it as divine approval. Meanwhile, merchants delayed voyages, armies postponed battles, and entire fleets sat anchored, all because the moon's face flickered. What's fascinating is how these events forced progress. The very terror of eclipses drove innovations in astronomy and navigation. Star maps grew more precise, timekeeping devices improved, and by the late Middle Ages, savvy captains began using eclipses to recalibrate their longitude estimates at sea. The cosmos that once ruled through fear was becoming a tool, one that would ultimately steer empires toward uncharted waters. The moon's shadow didn't just darken the sky, it illuminated the path to a new age of exploration. Before compasses became the trusted guides of the seas, medieval sailors navigated by something far more ancient, the stars. The night sky was their map, the moon their clock, and the constellations their unchanging landmarks. On clear nights, a skilled navigator could trace the curve of the Big Dipper to find Polaris, the North Star, holding steady while the rest of the heavens wheeled around it. The moon's phases marked the passage of time, its silvery light revealing the rhythm of the tides. But when an eclipse plunged the moon into darkness, that delicate system collapsed. Suddenly, the celestial signposts vanished, leaving ships adrift in a black expanse with no way to measure distance, direction, or time. Take the infamous voyage of the Genos merchant fleet in 1324. Bound for Constantinople with a cargo of saffron and silk, their navigators relied on a predictable lunar cycle to time their approach through the treacherous Dardanelles. Then, halfway through the journey, the moon disappeared. Without its light, the sailors misjudged the tides, their ships slamming into hidden shoals. The spices meant for Byzantine emperors sank into the sea, and the surviving crew spread stories of a sky gone wrong, omens so dire they sparked a temporary halt in Mediterranean trade. Coastal cities whose wealth depended on predictable lunar-driven tides saw their harbors empty as merchants waited for the heavens to stabilize. Lunar cycles weren't just about light, they dictated the very pulse of the ocean. Sailors from Venice to Canton knew that full moons brought the highest tides, perfect for slipping into shallow ports, while new moons meant calmer waters for open sea travel. An eclipse disrupted that rhythm like a skipped heartbeat. In 1188, a Norse fleet aiming to raid the English coast mistook an early lunar eclipse for the wrong phase of the moon, assuming the tides would be low. Their longships ran aground miles from their target, leaving them stranded for days, enough time for English forces to rally and repel the invasion. One misread celestial event altered the balance of power in the North Sea. The geopolitical stakes couldn't be higher. When the moon faltered, so did empires. The Mongol navy, sweeping across the South China Sea in the 13th century, timed their campaigns with lunar precision, using bright nights to coordinate their vast fleets. But during an eclipse in 1269, their signals failed, scattering ships across the straits. The delay gave the Song dynasty just enough time to reinforce their coastal defenses, turning the tide of a war that might have otherwise been lost. Meanwhile, Arab traders, masters of the Indian Ocean's monsoons, kept eclipse tables so accurate they could reroute entire caravans to avoid being caught in port during celestial unrest. What's striking is how these disruptions forced innovation. By the 14th century, Venetian navigators began cross-referencing eclipse records with their own logs, creating the first rudimentary almanacs to predict future events. In Lisbon, Prince Henry the Navigator's astronomers used lunar patterns to refine their charts, edging Europe closer to the age of exploration. The very phenomenon that once spelled disaster became a tool for mastery, proof that humanity's fear of the unknown could, in time, become the key to conquering it. The stars may have guided medieval sailors, but it was their struggle against the darkness that ultimately taught them to sail beyond it. The year was 1023, and the Byzantine Empire's grip on the Mediterranean hung by a thread. Emperor Basil II had spent decades securing his borders, but now his navy faced a threat no sword could repel, the heavens themselves. As his fleet prepared to strike against Arab forces off the coast of Sicily, the moon began to wither in the sky, its light draining away like sand through an hourglass. To the sailors, this wasn't just an eclipse, it was a divine verdict. Panic erupted on deck. Oarsmen crossed themselves, captains abandoned formation, and the entire armada scattered like leaves in a storm. The Arab ships, unshaken by the spectacle, seized the chaos, picking off Byzantine vessels one by one. What should have been a decisive victory became a humiliating rout, all because the moon dared to disappear. Michael Sellows, the era's sharpest chronicler, captured the aftermath in vivid detail. He wrote of seasoned admirals weeping on their knees, convinced the eclipse was God's punishment for their pride. Superstition drowned out strategy. The Navy's failure wasn't just a tactical loss, it fractured Byzantine confidence at sea. Within a decade, Arab corsairs dominated trade routes the empire had controlled for centuries, choking off vital grain shipments to Constantinople. The eclipse's shadow stretched far beyond that single night. It marked the beginning of the end for Byzantine naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. But here's what's fascinating. While Byzantium faltered, others were watching. In Cairo, Fatimid astronomers pored over the event, adding it to their growing catalogue of predictable celestial patterns. Venetian merchants, hearing whispers of the disaster, began training their navigators to differentiate myth from astronomy. And in the monasteries of Mount Athos, monks quietly compiled eclipse records, turning fear into data. The Byzantines saw a curse, the next generation saw a lesson. This shift wasn't instant. It took another eclipse, this time in 1084, to prove the point. When the moon darkened over the Adriatic, the Venetian fleet didn't panic. Their captains, armed with eclipse predictions from Arab star charts, held course and outmaneuvered a rival Sicilian squadron. The message was clear: the empires that would thrive weren't the ones praying to the heavens, but the ones learning to read them. The Byzantine eclipse of 1023 didn't just change the map of the Mediterranean, it changed how empires saw the sky itself. No longer just a backdrop for omens, it became a puzzle to solve, a clock to master, and ultimately a weapon to wield. The Norse sagas whisper of a night in 1066 when the moon turned the color of rust over the North Sea, a night that would alter the fate of kingdoms. Viking longships, sleek and swift, cut through the waves toward England under the command of Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king. But as they prepared to strike at Stamford Bridge, the sky intervened. The moon, their celestial guide, darkened mid-crossing. To the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, this was a sign of doom, a divine condemnation of the invaders. Yet the sagas tell a different story. Far from cowering in fear, Hardrada's navigators adjusted their course, using the eclipse's duration to recalibrate their position. While their enemies saw wrath, the Vikings saw data. What set these raiders apart wasn't just their swords, but their sunstones, to be exact. Archaeologists have unearthed these translucent crystals in Viking graves, their edges worn smooth from constant use. Held to the sky, they could pinpoint the sun's location even through cloud cover or, crucially, during the eerie twilight of an eclipse. Combined with their detailed lunar calendars carved into bone and wood, the Vikings treated celestial events not as mysteries but as navigational checkpoints. A 9th century runestone from Gotland even depicts a ship sailing beneath a crescent moon, its edges notched to mark eclipse cycles. These weren't superstitious men, they were early scientists of the sea. This adaptability fueled their dominance. When an eclipse disrupted their raids, Viking captains didn't retreat, they adapted. In 945, a fleet bound for Normandy used a blood moon's prolonged darkness to mask their approach, slipping past Frankish sentries who mistook the dimmed horizon for dawn. Later, Norse traders in Dublin timed their departures to lunar phases, avoiding eclipses that might strand them in hostile ports. Their secret, a network of lunar observatories from Greenland to Kiev, where skalds, part poets, part astronomers recorded celestial patterns and shared them like battle plans. But eclipses didn't just shape raids, they rerouted entire economies. When a 1084 eclipse darkened the Baltic, Norse traders abandoned their usual route through the Øresund Strait, fearing the Danes would exploit the chaos to impose tolls. Instead, they forged a perilous new path around Scandinavia's northern tip. A gamble that paid off. They discovered richer trading partners among the Sami people, swapping walrus ivory for iron at rates that made the risk worthwhile. The eclipse, once a navigational hiccup, had unwittingly expanded their trade empire. The Vikings' real legacy wasn't just their raids, but their refusal to be ruled by the sky. Where others saw omens, they saw opportunity. Their sunstones and lunar almanacs laid the groundwork for the quadrant and the astrolabe, tools that would later propel Europe into the age of exploration. The next time you hear of a lunar eclipse, remember, 1,000 years ago, it wasn't just a spectacle, it was a challenge, one that the Vikings met not with fear, but with ingenuity. And in that meeting, history was made. While medieval Europe grappled with eclipse superstitions halfway across the world, Arab and Chinese merchants were turning celestial events into a science of commerce. The Indian Ocean spice trade pulsed to the rhythm of the moon. Monsoons, tides, and eclipses dictated when ships dared to sail. Ibn Battuta, the famed 14th century traveler, wrote of being stranded for weeks in Calicut after an eclipse spooked local crews. No captain would risk open waters with the moon's face veiled, he noted, describing how warehouses overflowed with pepper and cinnamon as fleets waited for celestial reassurance. But this wasn't just fear, it was strategy. Arab navigators, armed with precise eclipse tables from Baghdad's observatories, knew exactly when to delay departures and when to capitalize on rivals' hesitation. What set these traders apart was their mastery of timing. Chinese junks sailing the Maritime Silk Road planned entire voyages around lunar cycles, using eclipses as natural checkpoints. A surviving logbook from Admiral Zheng, his fleet details how they anchored near Malacca during a 1421 eclipse, avoiding the chaos of darkened seas while Portuguese ships, still reliant on guesswork, floundered in the straits. The difference, Islamic and Chinese astronomers had long since decoded the Saros cycle, the 18-year pattern, governing eclipses, giving their merchants an edge as precise as any compass. In the cutthroat world of spice trading, knowing when the moon would vanish wasn't just astronomy, it was economic warfare. Eclipse records did more than guide ships, they redrew maps. Arab cartographers like Al-Idrisi incorporated lunar data into their portallands, noting how eclipses revealed errors in coastal charts. When the shadow's edge passed over a known port at an unexpected hour, it exposed flaws in longitude estimates, prompting corrections that made their maps the envy of Europe. A stunning example survives in the Kitab al-Bahr, a 15th century navigational manual where eclipse timings are scribbled beside trade winds and currents, proving how celestial events grounded earthly geography. The contrast with Europe couldn't be starker. While Venetian merchants still crossed themselves at eclipses, their Arab counterparts treated them as spreadsheets calculating risks, rerouting caravans, and charging premiums for eclipse-proof cargo insurance. By the time Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama entered the Indian Ocean, they weren't just facing superior ships, they were generations behind in celestial literacy. It's no accident that the spice routes remained under Islamic and Chinese control for centuries. Their advantage wasn't just sails or swords, it was written in the stars. The Mongol Armada that set sail for Japan in 1267 was unlike anything the islands had ever seen. Over 900 ships, their decks crammed with warriors who had conquered continents. Kublai Khan's navy was a force of sheer terror, its reputation preceding it like storm clouds. But on the night of their approach, something far more ominous loomed overhead. The moon, usually a beacon for night maneuvers, began to vanish. As the eclipse reached its peak, the Mongol troops, many conscripted from lands where eclipses symbolized divine displeasure, found themselves paralyzed. Whispers spread through the ranks. Had the heavens turned against them? The very sky seemed to be unraveling their invasion before a single arrow was loosed. Historians often focus on the typhoons that later shattered the Mongol fleet, the so-called kamikaze, or divine wind, but the eclipse played its own quiet role in their undoing. Contemporary Japanese scrolls depict Mongol soldiers casting uneasy glances skyward, their discipline fraying as the moon's light flickered out. This wasn't just superstition, it was psychological warfare. The defenders of Kyushu, well versed in their own celestial traditions, recognized the moment's power. They lit massive bonfires along the coast, their flames mirroring the eclipse's eerie glow, amplifying the sense of impending doom. By the time the storm struck days later, the Mongols were already half defeated, not by swords, but by the crushing weight of celestial uncertainty. Yet the story often told that eclipses alone doomed Kublai Khan's ambitions is oversimplified. The real lesson lies in logistics. Mongol naval tactics, honed on rivers and coastal raids, faltered in open waters. Their ships, built hastily from green timber, leaked under seasoned sailors' feet. And crucially, their eclipse predictions lagged far behind Arab or Chinese standards. While Song dynasty astronomers could pinpoint lunar events years in advance, the Mongols relied on captured scholars whose warnings often reached commanders too late. That 1267 eclipse didn't just demoralize troops, it exposed a fatal gap in their mastery of the seas. The aftermath reshaped empires. Kublai Khan's successors abandoned grand naval campaigns, turning inward to fortify their land borders. Meanwhile, Japanese chroniclers wove the eclipse into their victory narratives, cementing the belief that their islands were divinely protected, a myth that would echo for centuries. And in Europe, where rumors of the Mongol sky betrayal spread through merchant networks, a new realization took hold. Controlling the seas required more than brute force. It demanded celestial literacy. Venetian diplomats began collecting eclipse records from Arab traders. Portuguese shipwrights studied the wrecks that washed ashore in Korea, seeking clues about Mongol miscalculations. What began as a darkened moon over the East China Sea rippled outward, a reminder that empires rise and fall not just on battlefields, but in the silent interplay of human ambition and the cosmos. The Mongols learned the hard way: you can conquer nations, but the sky bows to no one. By the 15th century, Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator wasn't just funding ships, he was funding science. His court at Sagres became a beacon for astronomers, cartographers, and instrument makers, all united by a single goal: to conquer the chaos of the open ocean. While most of Europe still saw eclipses as omens, Henry's scholars pored over Arabic star charts and Jewish eclipse tables, transforming celestial events into navigational tools. Their breakthrough was the Regimento do Astrolabio, a manual teaching sailors to use lunar eclipses as celestial checkpoints. When the moon darkened, its position revealed a ship's longitude with unprecedented accuracy, a revelation that turned guesswork into geometry. Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1497 showcased this edge. His fleet carried not just sails and spices, but precise eclipse predictions calculated by Abraham Zacuto, Henry's former court astronomer. As da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, a lunar eclipse confirmed his position within 30 miles, a feat unimaginable to earlier explorers who might miss entire coasts by weeks. Portuguese captains called these moments horas de sombra, shadow hours, and guarded their eclipse almanacs like state secrets. While Venetian and Genos rivals relied on coastal landmarks, Portugal's ships could strike boldly across open seas, their confidence written in the stars. Yet eclipses weren't just tools, they were theater. Take the infamous lunar eclipse of 1504, when Columbus, stranded in Jamaica, allegedly warned hostile islanders that God would darken the moon unless they provided food. The story, likely embellished by later chroniclers, reveals more about European attitudes than events. Whether or not Columbus staged the eclipse as a bluff, the tale endured because it fit a larger narrative. The sky itself seemed to endorse colonial ambitions. The real power of eclipses lay in their duality. For Portugal, they were data points. For indigenous societies, they were cosmic dialogues. When da Gama's successors reached Brazil, they found Tupi tribes who'd tracked eclipses for generations, not as calculations, but as stories. One chief's reaction to Portuguese eclipse predictions survives in Jesuit letters. "You read the sky like a trail, we listen to it like a song." This cultural gap became a weapon. By presenting celestial events as European miracles, colonizers destabilized local cosmologies, weaving eclipses into the psychology of conquest. Behind the drama, though, a quiet revolution unfolded. Portuguese navigators began compiling eclipse records from Africa to Malacca, creating the first global dataset of celestial patterns. Their maps didn't just outline coasts, they annotated the sky's rhythms, turning fear into foresight. By the time the Dutch and English entered the colonial race, they weren't just chasing Portugal's ships, they were racing to replicate its celestial literacy. The moon's shadow, once a universal mystery, had become a measure of empire. The year 1560 should have been a triumph for Spain. Manila galleons, laden with silver from the Americas and silks from Asia, crisscrossed the Pacific in a golden age of imperial wealth. But on August 21st, as the fleet prepared to depart Acapulco, the moon began to dissolve. Ship logs from the San Pedro describe sailors dropping ropes in terror as the sky turned the color of old blood. The captain's frantic scribbles survive, "God has abandoned us to the darkness," followed by a chaotic 3-day delay as crews refused to sail under an unclean moon. By the time the fleet finally set out, they'd missed the optimal trade winds, dooming half the ships to storms that scattered their treasures across the ocean floor. This wasn't just bad luck, it was financial catastrophe. Spain's entire economy pulsed to the rhythm of these voyages. The eclipse disrupted silver shipments so severely that creditors in Genoa and Antwerp, who'd already spent phantom profits from the next fleet, faced ruin. Banks toppled like dominoes, inflation spiked as currency shortages gripped Europe. King Philip II's solution: doubled down on celestial guidance. His court swelled with astrologer advisors who claimed to predict eclipses for a fee, blending astronomy with outright mysticism. One, a Franciscan friar named Antonio de Cartagena, convinced the crown to schedule entire military campaigns around auspicious lunar phases, a policy that backfired spectacularly when Dutch rebels, unburdened by such dogma, raided Spanish ports during an eclipse-induced lull. Meanwhile, England's Elizabethan privateers smelled blood. Sir Francis Drake, armed with stolen Portuguese eclipse tables, timed his raids to Spanish superstitions. In 1579, he sacked Panama's treasure depot precisely when an eclipse had grounded Spain's patrol fleets. The loot funded England's first colony in Virginia, a direct result of celestial chaos exploited. Spanish captains, shackled by astrologers' mispredictions, watched helplessly as rivals turned their fear of the sky into a roadmap for empire. What's striking isn't just Spain's stumble, but how quickly the balance of power shifted. By 1600, Dutch navigators were publishing eclipse almanacs in vernacular Dutch, not Latin, ensuring every merchant could access celestial data Spain hoarded as state secrets. The eclipse of 1560 didn't just sink ships, it exposed the fragility of an empire that looked to the stars for answers but forgot to read them clearly. The lesson echoed across the Atlantic. In the race for global dominance, the real treasure wasn't silver, but the ability to navigate both sea and sky without flinching. Elizabethan England's rise as a naval power wasn't just built on cannons and courage, it was written in the stars. Behind the swagger of sea captains like Francis Drake stood an unlikely figure, John Dee, Queen Elizabeth's personal astrologer and a mathematical genius whose eclipse predictions became state secrets. Dee's cramped notebooks, filled with cryptic symbols and lunar calculations, held the key to England's pirate raids. His most famous forecast, the lunar eclipse of April 1580, which Drake used to ambush Spanish treasure ships off Cartagena. While Spanish crews panicked at the moon's disappearance, Drake's men, armed with Dee's precise timetables, struck under cover of celestial chaos. The haul, enough silver to fund England's navy for a year, wasn't just loot, it was a masterclass in turning astronomy into warfare. Naval records from Plymouth reveal how deeply eclipse lore seeped into England's strategy. Encrypted logs refer to lunar events as the Queen's shadows, with coordinates hidden in star charts. One surviving dispatch from 1582 instructs a captain to await the darkening before attacking a Spanish convoy near the Azores, a clear reference to Dee's prediction of that year's partial eclipse. Spanish investigators later dismissed these raids as luck, but the paper trail tells a different story. England wasn't just fighting ships, it was exploiting Spain's celestial illiteracy. While Spanish navigators still consulted astrologers, English captains carried almanacs with eclipse paths painstakingly calculated to the minute. The ultimate irony came in 1588, as the Spanish Armada lumbered toward England. That July, a total lunar eclipse bathed the channel in eerie red light, an event Dee had foreseen a decade prior. Spanish logs describe crews interpreting the blood moon as a divine warning, while English ships, guided by astronomers like Thomas Harriot, used it to recalibrate their positions under cloud cover. Within weeks, the Armada lay in ruins, scattered by storms and English fire ships. The eclipse hadn't caused Spain's defeat, but it crystallized a crucial truth: empires that mastered the sky commanded the seas. Yet England's advantage wouldn't last. Across the North Sea, Dutch cartographers were already improving on Dee's methods. By the 1590s, Leiden's printers mass-produced eclipse almanacs for merchants, democratizing knowledge Spain and England had hoarded. One particularly ingenious Dutch innovation, the eclipse compass, which used lunar shadow angles to determine longitude at sea, a tool that would later fuel the Dutch East India Company's dominance. The lesson was clear: in the age of sail, celestial events weren't just observed, They were weaponized, traded, and ultimately industrialized. The moon's shadow had become the invisible hand guiding empires toward modernity. The Dutch East India Company didn't just sail the oceans, they hacked them. While Spanish galleons cowered at eclipses and Portuguese captains clutched rosaries, the VOC's merchant admirals carried leather-bound almanacs filled with lunar predictions so precise they could time blockades down to the hour. Take the siege of Malacca in 1641, when Dutch commander Willem Janszoon used a partial eclipse to his advantage. Portuguese defenders, expecting the usual lull in attacks during celestial omens, let their guard down only for VOC ships to surge forward under cover of the moon's dimming light, capturing the spice hub while their rivals prayed. A surviving diary from Janszoon's navigator, Adrian van der Loof, spells it out. The shadow served us better than 30 cannons. They watched the sky, we watched the clock. What set the Dutch apart wasn't just their ruthlessness, but their paperwork. VOC archives in Amsterdam reveal meticulous eclipse logs alongside cargo manifests and profit margins. In 1638, a fleet bound for Batavia delayed departure by 3 days to avoid a lunar eclipse, not out of fear, but because their astronomers knew it would obscure the stars needed for navigation. The decision saved 12 ships from veering into Portuguese-controlled waters, a calculation scribbled in the margins of a ledger as coolly as grain prices. For these merchants, the heavens weren't mystical, they were logistical. Mediterranean powers, by contrast, clung to old paradigms. Venetian Senate records from the same period show debates over whether eclipses nullified trade contracts, with one senator arguing that celestial irregularities excused delayed payments. While the VOC treated eclipses as tidal patterns to exploit, Genos bankers still demanded clergy bless their ledgers after lunar events. The gap wasn't just technological, it was philosophical. Where Southern Europe saw divine intervention, the Dutch saw supply chain variables, but the VOC's real innovation was turning celestial data into diplomatic currency. During negotiations with the Sultanate of Ternate in 1652, Dutch envoys gifted eclipse predictions as a show of goodwill and subtle intimidation. A letter from Governor-General Joan Mietzeiker boasts how the Sultan, unnerved by their ability to name the hour of the moon's fading, granted exclusive clove rights. Meanwhile, Portuguese missionaries in the same court lost credibility by mispredicting an eclipse, their handwritten apology preserved in Goa's archives. The heavens no longer speak our language. The lesson echoed across oceans. By the late 17th century, even the Mongol Empire was hiring Dutch astronomers to calibrate their calendars, while English East India Company agents scrambled to steal VOC eclipse tables. What began as corporate efficiency had redrawn the rules of engagement, proving that in the age of empire, the sharpest weapon wasn't a sword, but a well-timed shadow. In 1572, the Ottoman admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa pulled off one of history's most audacious naval bluffs without firing a single shot. Facing a combined Spanish and Venetian fleet near Corfu, he spread rumors through captured sailors that an eclipse would darken the moon in 3 nights' time, signaling divine wrath against his enemies. There was just one problem: no eclipse was due. Yet as the fabricated date approached, Venetian oarsmen began refusing orders, convinced the sky itself condemned their mission. By the time the moon rose unchanged, Barbarossa's ships had already slipped past their demoralized foes. The ruse worked because eclipses weren't just celestial events, they were psychological weapons, their power rooted in the terror of the unknown. A generation later, the Venetian-Ottoman Wars saw this strategy refined to chilling precision. During the Battle of Cape Celedonia in 1612, Ottoman commanders leaked falsified eclipse predictions to Venetian spies, claiming the moon would vanish at the battle's climax. As the fleets engaged, a cloud bank coincidentally obscured the moon at the predicted hour, convincing the Venetians the prophecy was real. Panic spread like wildfire. Ships collided in the chaos, and the Ottomans picked them off at leisure. Post-battle interrogations reveal Venetian captains insisting they'd witnessed an eclipse, proof of how easily fear could rewrite reality. What makes these deceptions so fascinating is their ethical ambiguity. Unlike poisoned wells or false flags, eclipse hoaxes exploited a shared human vulnerability, our instinct to seek meaning in the heavens. A 15th-century manual for naval commanders, the Tactica Navalis, even listed fake eclipse rumors as a legitimate tactic, arguing that he who masters men's awe of the sky masters their hearts. Modern parallels are unnerving. Just as 16th-century sailors mistook clouds for divine signs, today's algorithms weaponize misinformation, exploiting our cognitive biases with the same precision as Barbarossa's astrologers. The battlefield has shifted from moonlit seas to social media feeds, but the playbook remains eerily similar. Yet even as eclipses became tools of deception, they also drove scientific breakthroughs. The very same century that saw Barbarossa's trickery also witnessed Tycho Brahe's observatory meticulously tracking lunar cycles, proving eclipses followed predictable patterns. By 1650, Jesuit astronomers in China were distributing accurate eclipse tables to merchant fleets, stripping away the superstitions commanders had once exploited. Naval logs from the Anglo-Dutch Wars show captains coolly noting eclipses as navigational aids rather than omens, a quiet revolution in humanity's relationship with the cosmos. The sky hadn't changed, but our ability to read it had, turning a source of terror into a tool of progress. The age of celestial warfare didn't end because empires grew more moral. It ended because science rendered their oldest tricks transparent. Galileo's telescope didn't just reveal the moons of Jupiter, it shattered an entire worldview. When he trained his lens on the heavens in 1609, documenting lunar craters and the mechanics of eclipses with unprecedented precision, he unwittingly handed naval powers a weapon far deadlier than any cannon: predictability. For centuries, eclipse forecasts had been guarded secrets, locked in monastery libraries or whispered between royal astronomers. But Galileo's published star charts, with their meticulous timetables of celestial events, spilled into the hands of merchant captains and pirate admirals alike. Protestant Dutch printers, unconstrained by Catholic censorship, mass-produced his findings, while Mediterranean fleets still waited for Vatican-approved almanacs. The gap wasn't just technological, it was ideological. The consequences rippled across empires. In 1639, a total lunar eclipse visible from Goa became a stark case study. Portuguese navigators, bound by church doctrine that still questioned heliocentrism, relied on outdated tables that placed the eclipse an hour late. Dutch East India Company ships, armed with Galileo-inspired calculations, timed their attack on a Portuguese spice convoy to coincide with the moon's darkest moment. The result, a bloodless rout. Portuguese crews, convinced the eclipse had arrived early by divine intervention, abandoned their posts in panic, while the Dutch looted holds full of pepper and cinnamon under the very shadow their rivals feared. What's often overlooked is how this played out beyond Europe. In Istanbul, Ottoman admirals, no strangers to celestial navigation, received conflicting reports. Jesuit astronomers in their employ clung to Ptolemaic models, while renegade Greek scholars smuggled in Galileo's data. Court records show Sultan Murad IV demanding an explanation for the eclipse's timing, only to be given 3 different answers. The delay cost the Ottomans dearly. Their fleet missed a critical window to intercept Venetian reinforcements in the Aegean. Meanwhile, in Protestant England, navigators pored over pirated Italian star charts, cross-referencing them with Puritan sermons that framed eclipse mastery as a divine right. The message was clear: in the new age of exploration, dogma sailed at half speed. Yet the real revolution wasn't just in telescopes or timetables, it was in mindset. Galileo's heresy trial in 1633 forced a choice. Would navies treat the sky as a realm of unchanging signs or a system of solvable puzzles? The Dutch answered by founding Leiden Observatory, where scholars like Willebrord Snellius refined eclipse predictions into maritime insurance policies. Venetian shipowners, by contrast, paid priests to bless their vessels after lunar events, a tradition that persisted into the 18th century. The divergence wasn't merely cultural, it was financial. Dutch insurers charged lower premiums for eclipse season voyages, confident in their astronomy, while Mediterranean merchants saw rates skyrocket to cover acts of God. The 1650 eclipse over the Caribbean laid bare this divide. Spanish treasure fleets, warned by Rome to avoid sailing during celestial unrest, sat idle in port as English privateers, armed with Newtonian physics, raided undefended colonies. A smuggled letter from Havana's governor to Madrid captures the frustration. Our father's stars no longer guide us while heretics navigate by stolen light. The Enlightenment's great irony: the very tools the Church suppressed became the keys to imperial survival. By 1700, even the Vatican's own Naval Academy quietly adopted Galilean calculations, proving that in the end, data, not doctrine, dictated who ruled the waves. What began as a monk's squabble over telescope lenses ended as a lesson in power. The empires that thrived weren't those who feared the moon's shadow, but those who measured it and, in measuring, mastered the tides of history. James Cook's voyage to Tahiti in 1769 wasn't just about charting stars. It was a masterclass in imperial ambition disguised as scientific curiosity. The Royal Society's official mission was to observe a rare transit of Venus, but tucked in Cook's orders were quieter instructions: map uncharted coasts, assess resources, and plant the flag of British influence under the cover of celestial study. When a lunar eclipse darkened Tahiti's skies that July, Cook's crew didn't just record it, they weaponized it. Using the eclipse to recalibrate their chronometers, they achieved longitude calculations accurate to within 8 miles, a feat that transformed the Pacific from a navigational gamble into a chessboard for empire. But the real story unfolds in the shadows of those calculations. Tahitian priests, who'd tracked eclipses for generations as sacred events, watched in disbelief as British sailors scribbled in notebooks instead of offering prayers. Oral histories preserved by elders describe the eclipse as Te Marama Ngaro, the stolen moon, a celestial theft mirroring the land seizures that followed. Cook's journals, meticulous about tide patterns, dismiss indigenous eclipse lore as childish superstitions, erasing knowledge systems that had guided Polynesian navigators across thousands of miles of open ocean. The irony: without adopting Polynesian star compass techniques earlier in the voyage, Cook might never have reached Tahiti to exploit their skies in the first place. These expeditions weren't isolated incidents. French astronomer Guillaume Legentle's failed eclipse chase to India in 1761 exposed the darker logistics of scientific voyages. Stranded for years after missing his observation window, Legentle documented how the British East India Company used his mission's maps to tighten control over Bengali silk routes. Celestial navigation, once a tool for survival, had become scaffolding for colonial extraction. Even the instruments told the story. Cook's sextant, engraved with the Royal Society's crest, was funded by the same admiralty that bankrolled Caribbean sugar plantations. Yet indigenous voices refused silence. In Newfoundland, Micmac hunters corrected British astronomers' eclipse predictions in 1780, pointing to oral traditions that placed the event a day earlier. Hawaiian chanters composed Mil Inoa for the 1859 eclipse, embedding warnings about foreign ships in the lyrics, a celestial protest overlooked by the American scientists who recorded only the eclipse's duration. The suppression wasn't incidental, it was strategic. Colonial powers understood that controlling eclipse narratives meant controlling time itself, relegating native knowledge to footnotes while their own calculations anchored global trade. By the dawn of industrialization, eclipses had shed their mystique entirely, reduced to cogs in the machinery of progress. Factories synchronized shifts by eclipse almanacs, knowing workers would mistake the sudden darkness for nightfall and clock out early. Railroad barons timed track expansions to celestial events, exploiting indigenous communities' disorientation during eclipses to push through contested land. The sky, once a shared canvas of stories, had been parceled into data points, a commodity as ruthlessly exploited as the colonies beneath it. The moon's shadow still fell, but now it traced the silhouette of empire. By 1806, British naval officer Robert Fitzroy still scribbled frantic notes as a lunar eclipse darkened the Pacific, recording the moon's color, the stars visible around it, even the nervous chatter of his crew. His log reads like a medieval chronicle. The men crossed themselves. The cook swore he saw demons in the rigging. Just 50 years later, another ship's log from the same waters barely mentioned an even grander eclipse, a single dismissive line between boiler pressure readings and coal consumption. Lunar obscuration observed, no bearing on course. The difference: steam. As black smoke replaced white sails, the heavens lost their tyranny over human ambition. The shift wasn't just technological, it was psychological. Early steamships like Brunel's SS Great Western still carried sextants, but their captains joked about grandfather's toys. No longer shackled to trade winds or tide charts, they plowed through calms and storms alike, their engines drowning out the whispers of superstitious crews. A revealing account from the HMS Agamemnon in 1853 describes sailors hiding charms in the coal bunkers during an eclipse, while the officers played cards unconcerned. The ship's doctor noted, the stokers, faces streaked with soot, glance upward more often than at the pressure gauges. Progress had arrived, but fear lingered in the shadows. Empires that embraced this change reaped the rewards. British naval surveys, once painstakingly calibrated by lunar observations, now raced ahead with steam-powered accuracy, mapping harbors from Hong Kong to Halifax in months, not years. Meanwhile, the Ottoman fleet clung to celestial navigation well into the 1870s, their magnificent sail-powered ships reduced to floating anachronisms. A humiliating incident in 1868 saw two Turkish frigates collide during an eclipse because their crews abandoned posts to pray, while a nearby French steamer adjusted its course without breaking stride. Yet the real surprise was how quickly the knowledge faded. By 1880, young officers at the Royal Naval College struggled to calculate longitude using lunar distances, a skill that had defined their grandfathers' careers. The Admiralty quietly phased out eclipse training, repurposing observatories as signal stations. Only in remote corners of empire did the old ways endure. Whalers off Patagonia still timed their harpoons by the moon's phases, and Malay pearl divers consulted eclipse almanacs handed down through generations. Today's GPS satellites have rendered celestial navigation nearly extinct, but the echoes of that lunar dependence linger. Modern cruise ships stage eclipse viewing parties as entertainment, serving cocktails under what was once a navigational crisis. The International Space Station, orbiting beyond the reach of ancient omens, captures lunar eclipses in high definition, a spectacle stripped of terror, transformed into content. Yet every few years, when a solar storm disrupts satellite signals, naval cadets still dust off sextants and star charts, rehearsing a dance their ancestors knew by heart. The sky may have lost its power to dictate our course, but its lessons in adaptability remain written in the stars. Ghost ships and blood-red moons, no celestial event haunted sailors' imaginations like an eclipse. Among the most enduring legends is the Flying Dutchman, said to materialize when the moon vanishes, its tattered sails glowing against the darkened sky. Dutch maritime records from 1729 describe crews spotting the phantom vessel during a lunar eclipse near the Cape of Good Hope, its captain doomed to forever sail under a cursed sky. But the Dutchman was just one spectre in a fleet of eerie tales. Breton fishermen whispered of the Marie Celeste, a ghostly trawler that appeared during eclipses to guide lost ships, only to vanish at first light, leaving wrecks in its wake. These stories weren't just campfire entertainment, they were oral almanacs encoding real dangers. A vanished moon often meant rogue waves or sudden squalls, and folklore preserved those warnings in spectral disguises. By the 19th century, lighthouse keepers became myth-busters of the sea. Their logs, meticulously preserved from Scotland to Singapore, tell a different story. One entry from 1883 at Cape Race Lighthouse recounts how keepers timed an eclipse to the second, using it to calibrate their chronometers while local fishermen huddled ashore, fearing the dead would rise with the shadow. Scientific journals like the Nautical magazine published these accounts side by side with sailors' superstitions, creating a bizarre duality. The same eclipse might be logged as 8 hours 32 minutes of totality by a keeper, while a nearby schooner's crew swore they heard ghostly chanting in the rigging. The collision of old and new worldviews played out dramatically in the age of steamships. In 1896, passengers aboard the SS Persia panicked during a lunar eclipse, convinced the apparition of a Viking longship was pacing their hull. The captain, armed with a newly published Admiralty Eclipse Manual, calmly invited them to the bridge, where he demonstrated how the phantom was just their own shadow cast on fog. Yet even as science demystified the skies, tradition clung stubbornly. Whalers off Newfoundland still carved eclipse dates into their harpoons as late as 1900, believing the moon's darkness made whales surface more often, a superstition that, ironically, held a kernel of truth, as lunar cycles did affect some migration patterns. Today, these tales live on in surprising ways. Modern container ships may navigate by satellite, but eclipse lore thrives in maritime museums and sailors' tattoos. The Flying Dutchman inspired safety protocols. Some cruise lines still avoid scheduling drills during eclipses to prevent crew unease. And when the 2017 solar eclipse crossed America, coastal towns revived century-old eclipse festivals, part homage to tradition, part tourist attraction. The moon's shadow no longer dictates our voyages, but its power to captivate remains as vast as the sea itself. The hum of a GPS receiver seems light, years removed from the age of sextants and star charts, yet buried in its silicon heart lies an ancient lineage, the precise mathematics of eclipses. Those same lunar shadow calculations that guided Portuguese caravels now fine-tune satellite orbits, their algorithms descendants of Prince Henry the Navigator's eclipse tables. Modern nav systems may render celestial navigation obsolete, but they inherit its DNA. Take the 1972 total eclipse over the North Atlantic, an event that briefly turned technology on its head. During the Cod Wars, Icelandic fishing trawlers, outgunned by British radar, used the eclipse's electromagnetic interference to vanish from screens, slipping through blockades under cover of celestial static. For a few shadowed hours, the old ways trump the new. This dance between nature and innovation plays out in unexpected corners. Cyber warfare strategists now study eclipse history for inspiration, noting how Barbarossa's fake eclipse rumors parallel modern disinformation campaigns. Just as medieval admirals weaponized celestial uncertainty, today's hackers exploit digital eclipses, moments when system outages or solar flares create chaos to exploit. The Pentagon's Project Aurora even simulates eclipse-induced satellite disruptions to stress-test military networks, proving that the sky's tricks still shape terrestrial power struggles. Yet the deeper question lingers: have we truly escaped nature's leash, or just traded one set of chains for another? Satellite fleets may navigate by atomic clocks, but a solar storm can scatter them like frightened gulls. The 2003 Northeast blackout, triggered by geomagnetic activity, plunged millions into darkness, a reminder that our grids remain as vulnerable to cosmic whims as any medieval fleet. Perhaps those Viking sunstones weren't so primitive after all. Their fail-safe simplicity outlasts any battery. As we stand on the brink of interplanetary travel, the irony thickens. NASA Artemis program trains astronauts in celestial navigation as a backup for when lunar dust clogs their sensors. The very skills Cook's crew used to colonize Tahiti may guide the first Mars settlers. History's pendulum swings full circle, not from superstition to science, but toward a synthesis where ancient wisdom and cutting-edge tech orbit each other like twin stars. The next time your phone pinpoints a coffee shop, remember, you're navigating by the ghosts of eclipses past, their shadows still whispering across the digital deep. Deep beneath the waves, amidst the skeletal remains of medieval ships, lies an unexpected treasure, not gold or silver, but fragments of celestial knowledge. Archaeologists recovering a 13th century Hanseatic cog off the Baltic coast made a startling discovery: waterlogged planks with faint, precise notches. At first dismissed as carpenter's marks, these grooves matched known eclipse cycles, likely carved by a navigator tracking lunar events between trade runs. This is archaeoastronomy in action, where shipwrecks become time capsules of lost sky lore. Teams are now using dendrochronology to cross-reference these carvings with tree ring data, which records atmospheric changes during eclipses. An oak beam from the same wreck shows abnormally narrow growth rings for 1221, aligning perfectly with chronicles of a great darkness over Lübeck that year. The ship's very timbers remembered what human records forgot. Ice cores from Greenland add another layer to the puzzle. Trapped air bubbles reveal spikes in sulfur deposits during known eclipse years, likely from volcanic activity that amplified the moon's red hue, a detail echoed in Norse sagas describing fire-edged shadows. By stitching together these disparate clues, ship carvings, tree rings, ice chemistry, researchers have reconstructed eclipse timelines with startling accuracy. A Venetian galley's logbook, previously dismissed as myth for describing an eclipse in 1308, was vindicated when Antarctic ice cores confirmed heightened dust levels that same year, caused by a Saharan sandstorm visible during totality. Nature, it seems, kept better records than humans. Now, artificial intelligence is deciphering what once seemed indecipherable. Fragmented logs from the Hanseatic League, their ink faded to near invisibility, are being scanned with multispectral imaging. Machine learning algorithms trained on medieval dialects and astronomical patterns have resurrected lost accounts, like a 15th century Dutch captain's frantic note about the moon's theft delaying a spice convoy. One AI reconstruction even revealed a previously unknown eclipse in 1412, documented by a Genos navigator who linked it to a subsequent plague outbreak, showing how celestial events shaped not just trade but collective memory. These discoveries are rewriting history. The long-held assumption that medieval sailors feared eclipses unconditionally crumbles when confronted with a 1392 Portuguese star chart, its margins filled with calculations predicting lunar shadows down to the minute. Another breakthrough came when AI matched a ship's bell recovered near Gibraltar, inscribed with zodiac symbols, to eclipse predictions used by Jewish astronomers exiled from Spain. Science is uncovering a hidden world of cross-cultural collaboration, where knowledge flowed as freely as the tides. What does this mean for us today? Just as medieval mariners pieced together navigation from scattered clues, modern researchers are learning to see the past in new dimensions, where a ship's timber, a bubble of ancient air, or a smudged parchment can illuminate entire eras. The next time you check a weather app or GPS, remember, our precision rests on centuries of accumulated sky watching, much of it salvaged from the ocean's depths. The past isn't just behind us, it's beneath us, waiting to be read like the stars. Rising sea levels and superstorms have already forced modern sailors to reconsider what was once considered obsolete knowledge. In ports from Maine to Tasmania, boutique navigation schools now offer retro-celestial courses where students trade GPS units for sextants and eclipse almanacs. What began as a hipster hobby like brewing mead or forging Viking jewelry has taken on unexpected urgency. When Hurricane Maria wiped out Puerto Rico's power grid in 2017, amateur radio operators used lunar eclipse timings to coordinate relief efforts, their handheld star charts outperforming satellite phones drowned in static. The lesson: our ancestors' contingency plans might outlast our own, but there's danger in nostalgia. The same online forums where sailors swap medieval navigation tips also buzz with apocalyptic fantasies, preppers stockpiling brass sextants alongside canned goods, convinced technology will fail but parchment star maps will endure. This selective memory ignores history's brutal realities. Yes, Polynesian navigators crossed oceans using only the stars, but their success relied on generations of collective knowledge, not a weekend workshop. A 15th century Portuguese caravel might have survived an eclipse, but its crew still succumbed to scurvy. Romanticizing the past blinds us to its hardships while absolving present responsibility. Why fix climate change if we can just dust off old almanacs? The real parallel lies not in tools but in mindset. Medieval sailors didn't conquer the Atlantic because they feared the unknown. They did so by systematically transforming terror into data. When Venetian merchants noticed eclipse-induced tides flooding their warehouses, they didn't abandon the docks. They built higher foundations. Today's innovators follow similar logic. Dutch engineers designing floating cities study how eclipse-driven tides eroded medieval seawalls, while SpaceX programmers model orbital debris paths using algorithms adapted from eclipse prediction models. The through line isn't celestial mechanics, but adaptive intelligence, the willingness to learn from disruption rather than surrender to it. Perhaps the most profound legacy of eclipse navigation isn't in its techniques, but its philosophy. Those old star charts didn't just map the heavens, they encoded a worldview where humans were neither masters nor victims of nature, but participants in its rhythms. As glaciers melt and coastlines shift, that perspective feels newly vital. The next time you see a blood moon rising, consider this. The real challenge isn't relearning how to sail by the stars, but remembering how to think in cosmic time, where consequences unfold across generations, and survival depends on reading the sky not as a threat or a crutch, but as a teacher. Centuries of maritime history whisper a paradox: the same eclipses that terrified fleets into retreat also propelled empires to new heights, their shadows revealing both the fragility and ingenuity of human ambition. Whether Byzantine admirals scattering in panic or Dutch merchants coolly recalculating spice routes, responses to the moon's vanishing act didn't just reflect superstition or science, they measured a civilization's capacity to adapt. Consider the stark contrast. When Constantinople's navy mistook an eclipse for divine wrath in 1023, their defeat handed the Mediterranean to rivals for generations. Yet 6 centuries later, the Dutch East India Company turned lunar predictions into profit, eclipses now mere entries in ledgers beside cargo weights. The difference wasn't just technology, it was mindset. Where some saw cosmic omens, others saw celestial clocks, and in that shift, the balance of global power tilted irrevocably. The stories intertwine like rigging on a medieval cog. Viking sunstones guiding longships through eclipse-darkened seas, Genghi's star charts outmaneuvering Portuguese guesswork, Galileo's forbidden calculations stealthily arming Protestant privateers. Each moment reveals how mastery of the heavens translated to dominance on the waves. Even failures carried lessons. Spain's insistence on astrological eclipse interpretations left their treasure fleets languishing in port while England's pirate kings, armed with stolen astronomy, plundered with impunity. What began as terror of the unknown became, for those willing to learn, the ultimate strategic advantage. A weathered page from a 15th century Genos navigator's diary, preserved in a Valencia monastery, captures this duality. The moon's face darkened tonight as if God had blown out a candle. The crew wept, but I measured counting heartbeats between shadow's edge and masthead star. Perhaps heaven speaks in numbers after all. That fragile parchment embodies humanity's journey from awe to understanding, from praying to the sky to decoding its rhythms. The next time you watch a lunar eclipse, look beyond the spectacle. See instead the ghostly fleets it once guided or scattered, the empires swayed by its shadow, the centuries-long struggle to transform celestial mystery into navigational certainty. History turns on such moments not just in battles and trade wins, but in the quiet reckoning between fear and curiosity. Share your own overlooked turning points in the comments. Which eclipses, comets, or celestial events changed history's course in ways we've forgotten? And if these untold stories of sky and sea resonate with you, join us as we uncover more hidden threads weaving through time. Subscribe now, and let's keep exploring together.